I never believed in ghosts. That kind of thing was for movies and campfire stories, not for real life. At least, that's what I thought until I started the night shift at the old Danvers textile mill. I worked as a security guard, and the job sounded easy. Walk around the building, keep an eye on the cameras, and make sure nobody broke in. The pay wasn't great, but it was quiet work. Or so I thought. The mill had been abandoned for almost 40 years. It loomed over the nearby town like a skeleton of better days. Its windows broken and its walls stained with rust and grime. Locals avoided the place, calling it cursed. They spoke in hushed tones about a fire long ago, one that killed workers trapped in the basement. There was no proof, just stories. For me, it was just another shift. That Tuesday night started like any other. I made coffee in the control room, a small, musty office with flickering fluorescent lights, and a desk full of old security monitors. The screens showed black and white footage of the building. Empty halls, locked doors, and long stretches of silence. I told myself it would be another dull night. Around midnight, I grabbed my flashlight and began my first patrol. The air in the mill was heavy, stale, and filled with a faint metallic smell. The halls stretched on forever, cluttered with broken machinery and forgotten tools. My flashlight cast long, jagged shadows on the walls, and sometimes it felt like they were moving. I was walking past a row of lockers when I heard it. The sound was faint, but steady, coming from somewhere down the hall. My stomach tightened. "Hello!" My voice echoed down the corridor, but no one answered. "Hello!" I called again, but my voice seemed to vanish into the long, empty corridor, swallowed by the silence. I adjusted my grip on the flashlight, the metal, cold and slick in my sweaty hand, and took slow steps toward the noise. The knocking grew louder with each step, steady, like someone demanding to be let out. My heart thudded harder in my chest. The sound led me to an old row of lockers, their doors dented and covered in rust. The noise was definitely coming from one of them, the last one in the row. I hesitated, my breath catching. The knock came again, sharp and impatient, and I jumped. With a trembling hand, I grabbed the locker handle and pulled it open in one quick motion. The door creaked loudly, the sound splitting the silence like a scream. But when I shined my flashlight inside, my breath hitched. The locker was completely empty. No tools, no spiders, no rodents. Just empty, dark space that smelled faintly of old metal and dust. I let out a shaky breath and stepped back. Maybe it was just the building settling. Old places made weird noises all the time, right? But then I heard it. Laughter. It started soft, like someone trying to stifle a chuckle, but it quickly grew louder, deeper, rougher, like it came from a throat ruined by smoke. The sound echoed down the hallway, bouncing off the cold walls, and my stomach turned. The laughter didn't belong here. It wasn't something the wind or pipes could make. My pulse spiked, and I spun around, shining the flashlight wildly down the corridor. There was no one there, just shadows stretching endlessly into the dark. I bolted. My boots slapped against the cracked tile as I ran back to the control room, my breathing quick and shallow. I slammed the door behind me and twisted the lock, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. Back in the safety of the control room, I felt the cold sweat on my forehead and wiped it away with a shaky hand. My eyes went straight to the monitors, desperate for answers. But all the cameras showed the same thing. Empty hallways and dimly flickering lights. No movement, no people, nothing that could explain the laughter. It's just the wind. Old pipes, maybe. That's all. I muttered to myself, though my voice sounded unconvincing, even to me. I tried to calm myself, staring at the monitors for any sign of movement. That's when it happened. Every screen went black at once. Damn it! I hissed, panic creeping into my voice as I scrambled to reboot the system. My fingers fumbled over the controls, sweat slicking my palms. The seconds stretched out, each one heavier than the last, until the screens flickered back on. At first, the cameras showed the usual, the same empty corridors and abandoned machinery. Relief started to wash over me, but then I noticed something. On every monitor, there I was. I could see myself sitting in the control room, staring at the screens, just as I was doing now. My heart raced as I leaned closer to the monitors, trying to make sense of it. But it wasn't just me. Behind me, on the grainy black and white footage, something was standing in the corner of the room. A tall figure, impossibly thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into the back of my head. Its mouth was twisted into a wide, jagged grin, too large for its face. It didn't move, just stood there watching me on the screen. My stomach flipped, and I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the corners of the room. There was nothing there. I turned back to the monitors, my hands shaking, my breath shallow. The figure was gone. And then I heard it again. Laughter. This time it was coming from right outside the door.
Come out. I just want to talk.
It rasped from the other side of the door. The doorknob jiggled, the metal rattling in its frame. My stomach dropped. I took another step back, feeling my knees weaken. The knob turned slowly, and I froze, my flashlight shaking in my grip. Suddenly, the door burst open. I stumbled backward, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing. The hallway beyond was empty. No figure, no shadow, just darkness and the faint hum of the building. Relief barely had a chance to settle in before the laughter started again. This time, it was louder, closer, echoing through the control room like it was coming from everywhere at once. My panic exploded, and I bolted from the room, running blindly into the corridors beyond. My boots pounded against the floor as I ran, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Shadows flickered and stretched, twisting unnaturally as I passed. Then, in the corners of my vision, I started to see them. Faces, pale and gaunt, peering out from the gaps in the lockers. Gnarled hands with blackened, burned skin gripped the edges of door frames as I ran past. And the eyes, those glinting, empty eyes, followed me wherever I went. They weren't human. They couldn't be. Their twisted, charred shapes looked like nightmares come to life. Something burned and broken yet still moving. I didn't know how far I ran before I found myself at a door. The old break room. I shoved it open and slammed it shut behind me, locking it with shaking hands. The air hit me like a wall. It was thick and acrid, choking with the smell of burnt fabric and charred flesh. My flashlight flickered one last time and went out, plunging me into total darkness. Damn it! No! I hissed, shaking it, slapping it against my palm, but it was no use. The darkness was absolute, swallowing me whole. Then I heard them, whispers, soft at first, like the faint hiss of air escaping a tire. But they grew louder, overlapping, a chorus of voices speaking in words I couldn't understand. The sound seemed to come from every corner of the room, circling me, filling my head. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself this wasn't real. But deep down, I knew better.
I see you.
A voice whispered, sharp and clear, right behind me. My blood ran cold. I screamed, spinning around so fast I almost lost my balance. But there was nothing there. just darkness. The whispers swelled, louder and louder, surrounding me, filling my ears until I thought my head would burst. They overlapped in a chaotic, eerie symphony. Too many voices saying too many things at once. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel the malice behind them. It was like they were all watching me. Then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the whispers stopped. I gasped for air, my chest heaving. The silence was even worse, thick and oppressive. And then, with a soft buzz, the lights flickered on. But the room wasn't the same. The break room didn't look abandoned anymore. It looked like it had decades ago, clean and tidy. The table in the center was set with mismatched cups and steaming coffee, the smell rich and inviting. Chairs were pushed neatly into place, and on the walls hung faded posters reminding workers to stay safe and report hazards. At first, I felt a wave of relief, like maybe I had stepped into some strange, forgotten part of the building that still had power. But then I noticed the workers. They sat at the table, laughing and talking like nothing was wrong. But everything about them was raw. Their skin was blackened and cracked, as if it had been burned to ash and held together by sheer will. Their faces were twisted, their mouths stretched too wide when they smiled, and their eyes, those empty, hollow sockets, seemed to see everything. They didn't move like people. Their heads turned with sharp, jerky motions. Their hands twitched unnaturally, and their laughter was off. Too loud, too harsh, like a machine trying to mimic human joy. My legs felt weak, but I couldn't stop staring. My brain refused to make sense of what I was seeing. Then one of them looked directly at me. Its burned face twisted into something resembling a grin, exposing jagged, broken teeth like shards of glass. It stood up slowly, its movements stiff, as if every joint in its body was rusted.
Welcome back. We've been waiting for you.
My breath caught in my throat. My mind screamed at me to run, to move, to do anything, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen in place, caught in the creature's empty gaze. The others stopped laughing. One by one, they turned their heads toward me, their hollow eyes locking onto mine. The room was silent now, except for the faint creak of their stiff movements as they began to stand, their burned hands reaching for me. The air grew heavier, thicker, making it harder to breathe. The lights above flickered again, casting long, warped shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. And then they stepped closer. The darkness swallowed me whole, and for a moment, I felt nothing. No sound, no sight. Just a void so complete it felt as though I had ceased to exist. But then, slowly, my senses returned. I was still in the mill, standing in the hallway just outside the control room. My flashlight was in my hand, its beam steady and strong now, as though it had never flickered. The air was still, and the faint metallic smell that had clung to the place earlier was gone. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination? I turned toward the control room, needing to ground myself in something familiar. The door was open, the monitors buzzing softly, showing their usual grainy feeds of empty hallways. The break room camera was back to normal, just a dusty, forgotten room with overturned chairs and a cracked table. My chair was where I'd left it, my half-empty coffee still steaming on the desk. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for one thing. On the desk lay a photograph. I hadn't put it there, and it hadn't been there when I'd left for my patrol. My stomach knotted as I reached for it, my fingers trembling. It was a black and white photo of a group of workers standing in front of the mill. They were dressed in old-fashioned uniforms, their faces solemn and worn. I recognized the break room from the background, but the workers looked off. Their eyes were shadowed, their smiles too wide, their poses unnaturally stiff, like dolls propped up for display. And there, at the center of the group, was someone who looked exactly like me. The man wore the same uniform I was wearing now, his expression blank and lifeless. My heart pounded as I flipped the photo over. Scrawled on the back in faded handwriting were the words, "New hire, 1973. Welcome to the team." I staggered back, the photo slipping from my hand and fluttering to the floor. My breathing quickened as the monitors suddenly flickered, the static crackling louder and louder until it became unbearable. I looked down at my hands and my heart froze. They were blackened and cracked, the skin peeling away as if scorched by fire. My uniform was no longer intact but burned and tattered, smelling faintly of smoke and ash. The monitors suddenly flickered, the static crackling louder and louder until it became unbearable.
"Don't you remember?"
A voice whispered, low and close. I spun around, but the control room was empty. My flashlight fell from my grasp and rolled across the floor, casting long, spinning shadows. The lights overhead flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw them. Shadowy figures standing in the doorway, watching me with hollow, expectant eyes. The man who looked like me stepped forward, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette on tangled strings.
"You've always been here. We all have."
He said, his voice eerily calm. Before I could react, the world twisted around me, the walls of the control room stretching and warping into an endless, dark corridor. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I woke up in the control room just like always. My uniform was clean, my coffee steaming, and the monitors buzzing softly. I shook my head, trying to shake the fog that clung to my thoughts. Had I fallen asleep again? The first patrol was uneventful, just like it had always been. The mill was quiet, the same long shadows and faint dripping echoing through the halls. I passed the row of lockers, feeling a faint déjà vu, but brushed it off. When I returned to the control room, I noticed the photograph sitting on the desk. "New hire, 1973. Welcome to the team." Something about the words sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't figure out why. I shook my head and turned back to the monitors, sipping my coffee. It was going to be a long night. And then the footsteps started again. And as they echoed closer, and the photograph fell from my trembling hands, the truth hit me like a cold, unrelenting wave. I wasn't just working the night shift. I was part of it. The mill didn't let anyone leave. It consumed them, pulling them into its twisted history. The hollow-eyed figures I had seen weren't ghosts. They were workers, just like me, trapped forever in its decaying walls. And I was one of them. My reflection in the darkened monitor stared back. I was him, the man from the photo, the new hire. I was part of the workers the townspeople whispered about. The trapped workers, lost in the fire of Danvers' textile mill. Me, reliving my endless shift, doomed to patrol the same corridors, the same darkness, forever.